All right, so for correlations, the purpose is to shed more light on confusing passages and to come to grips with the interaction of adjacent passages. So if your passage is mostly theological, as opposed to narrative or something, the bulk of the correlation will be finding helpful cross references. So the effort you make is proportional to the difficulty of the passage at hand. You know, if you see a passage that just makes your head explode, if you need an example, have a look at 1 Peter 3:16 through 19 thereabouts, and yeah, your head will explode. That's a case where you need to bring in a lot of other passages to make sense of this. But if the passage is relatively straightforward, then correlation is not something you spend a lot of time on. In the non-theologically intensive passages, mostly correlation is done by observing the flow. So you can do a correlation chart. There's one in Appendix J, and the idea is it's kind of like a paragraph chart, but it's you just very informally sort of scribbles. And you say, well, this passage is about this, and this passage is that, and you maybe make some notes about each passage, and you kind of draw in circles and lines and stuff to kind of say, well, yeah, I see how these relate, how they flow together. There is a temptation to combine the correlation chart and the paragraph chart. That's okay for final presentation, but the correlation chart really isn't meant to be something you'll present at the end. That's just more of a working idea, something you can use to sort of figure out, what the flow is. So at the correlation phase, please note we are still asking, what does it say? We're merely looking at additional verses. We're trying to shed more light on the subject before we reach our conclusions. And point F here in section 6.1.2, doing a lot of cross references is not an end in itself. The goal is to study the passage at hand. You want to do correlation to the extent that it helps you with that goal. There was a guy in a study, probably in the mid 80s. It was really funny. We have homework. There's like 4 of us in the study. And this guy, it's like he'd say, okay, we're going to study these verses. And all his homework, he would have nothing on those verses. And all he would do is correlation at other verses. He's like, dude, you're not getting this. Great, correlation, love it. You've really failed to understand what we're trying to do. Look at these verses first and only do correlation to the extent that it's helpful with these ones. Now, when you're doing a cross-reference, try to find the references as close to the text in question as possible. So for instance, if you're in chapter 3 of some book and you've got some confusion, look verses elsewhere in chapter 3. If you don't find anything in chapter 3, look at chapter 1 and chapter 2 and chapter 4. Like, look in the same book. If that doesn't work, then look for, if it's a book Paul wrote and it's something confusing, look for other things Paul wrote. If you can't find anything that then look for stuff Peter and John. But you kind of look similar the more you can. One principle here is the best Bible commentary in the Bible is the Bible itself. So in resolving passages, when it's tricky, when it's confusing, is use the same author, and the logic is really simple, is really quite clear, actually. And the logic is, if you see one author saying one thing in the beginning of chapter 1 and another, and what appears to be the opposite at the end of chapter 1, well, you can do one of two things. You can just sort of assume the guy's an idiot. Well, now you're looking down on scripture. Or you can say, okay, so this was deliberate. He deliberately set this up where he said this, and then he sort of sets the counterpoint. And now you can start to realize, oh, it's kind of like going down on an overpass where there's a guardrail rail on the right and guardrail on the left, and you start to sort of view the two things as deliberately holding things in the middle. By the way, you can find cross-references by looking up keywords in a passage in a concordance. You can use a Bible that has footnotes or column notes that give cross-references. Again, there's nothing sacred about those cross-references. They're in most cases just some intern put them in there. You can look at commentaries. You can call them memorized verses, or Google on the internet. I am not a fan of looking on the internet. There's just no filter. Anybody could say anything, and you just get a lot of crazy stuff there. All right, section 6.1.3, well, that's interpretation. So now we're in business. So we've done all this effort on observation and correlation. We've got all this evidence. Now we're going to start in making some interpretations. So here's where we reach our conclusions. And again, you got to have lots of observations or you're doomed. So there's really two types of interpretations: overall flow and resolution of problems. So overall flow is just simply getting to the point where you, oh, I see his conversation, I see why he said this and then that. Just sort of coming to terms, following the flow of thought. Resolution of problem, again, that's the one where you see something like, oh, I don't know what this means. When we interpret, we look for what we call the literal plain normal hermeneutic, or we use the literal plain normal hermeneutic. That is, we look for the most straightforward interpretation. Um, you know, we try to understand it as it would be understood by a contemporary of the author. We don't just start allegorizing, unless there's a compelling reason to allegorize. Please note the fact you have a vivid imagination is not a compelling reason to allegorize. People go nuts on this phase. They allegorize and then they allegorize their allegory, and it's just, and it just the error is people try to show their cleverness as opposed to get back to the simple idea. What was the author trying to say? So Don Campbell, he was a president at Dallas Seminary years ago, and he calls the approach literal, grammatical, historical. And at the end of the day, here's what the assumption is. The assumption is that language has meaning. Now, there are other schools of thought where they say language has texts have no meaning, and the meaning's found in the author or the reader. There's all this stuff, reader response nonsense. I mean, if you were to send an email to somebody, you've got something to say, and the only way they're going to get that is if they're looking for what you're trying to say, as opposed to just trying to creatively interpret what you're doing. So our basic assumption is that language has meanings. Another important note is, we form our doctrine in light of Scripture. We don't alter our hermeneutic to fit our doctrine. Like we come to a passage and like, well, I believe this, so I'm just going to assume the verse is saying it. Well, you see, when you do this kind of Bible study, that's a real good time to kind of question yourself. I've always thought this, and I'll give you a real clear example. This whole predestination versus free will. That's a sticky issue, and I'm not going to tell you what side I'm on. But you tend to get one, and then you see a verse that says, the opposite of your view, and there's two ways you can handle it. You can try to sort of dismiss the verse and make it go away, or you can lean into the fact that maybe there isn't something you understand. Try to understand what you get from holding both views. So the Scripture is what's authoritative. Your doctrinal position is just something you kind of do as a convenience. And again, when we interpret, so this is point E on the top of page 14, we're looking for the one meaning that the author had in mind when he wrote the passage. That's key, right? He was trying to say one thing. Now, there may be several implications, but he was trying to say one thing. What was he trying to say, he or she trying to say? Now, it's not to say we can't apply it to our lives in clever ways. I mean, that's kind of the essence of application. But it is to say that when the Bible was written, it meant something. Fee and Stewart have this, they have what they call their basic rule number one. A text cannot mean what it could never have meant to its author or its recipients. See, it was written in a context and it meant something, and we want to get to that. All right, application. So application is the whole point of studying the Bible. We don't study to stuff our head with facts. We study to be conformed to the image of Christ. If you ignore this, if you habitually blow it off, that is going to end badly. And I'm just going to tell you, that's how you become a fool. In this passage, or this phase rather, we ask the simple question, what does this mean for me today? Now, this is what we don't ask. So what's this mean for those guys over there? You're missing it. This is between you and God. What is he trying to say to you? Look for practical things. You're looking for sins that he calls to mind, or good works you need to embark on. One way when I was in college with the Navigators was always emphasized that, and I think there's real value to this, is look for real practical and measurable applications. So when I was, a junior in college, I was studying James, and I read all this stuff about orphans and widows, and I was like, I need to sponsor a kid from, one of these Compassion International things. And here I am. That was 40 years ago, and still got a whole bunch of these kids we sponsor. And it just all came out of that. Oh my gosh, I need to do this. So, a weaker application would be to, like, oh, I need to be more sensitive to orphans. Well, yeah, you do. It's kind of a lousy application because, like, nothing happens. So if you can find one where something happens, that's fantastic. And you really want to have right actions, not just right thinkings. And that's kind of why we like this idea of carrying through things. So, having said that, there are applications that deal with the heart. Okay, so I see this passage. How does this change my view of God? How does this change my relationship with God? How does this, my heart needs to want to be holy, or, all these kind of things, motivational ideas, encouragements, inspiring thoughts, sometimes new perspective, aligning our perspectives with God's perspectives is a really important part of spiritual growth, learning to have the mind of Christ. This is what that's called, thinking biblically. You're always kind of looking for memory verses. I'm telling you, if you're new at this, there's nothing that'll have a higher return on investment than memorizing scripture. And, a subtle pitfall, like I mentioned, is to avoid losing personal focus on your application. As Bible teachers, we do want to find things that apply to our people, and we will do that. But there's a process here. First, let's find the things. Let's get ourselves squared away. And it's really a fool's errand to come to a passage to find something for somebody else. We go, and what the idea is, we want to teach out of the overflow. You learn, you understand what this passage is, you understand how God's speaking to you, and then you're in a position where now you can speak out of the overflow, and you've really got something to say. So let's see. I'm now on page 15 on letter H. We're pushing towards specifics. For example, suppose you're studying 1 Peter 1:15. It's tempting to have a vague application like, I need to be more holy. Well, that's great. That's kind of the passage. But you want to push it to a specific, push it to, well, where are you browsing on the internet? Okay, now that's just getting rude. Yeah, that's kind of the idea. Push it there. What magazines you're reading, what places you're visiting, what the, really bringing this vague concept, this important concept, but kind of vague, be holy. Okay, no, this means you'll do this in this situation. And another thing to do is sometimes there's value in coming up with just really thought-provoking questions, piercing questions where you write it down, and this is something to meditate on.